guest speaker this afternoon. I just wanted to start by noting that this is a really interesting topic. How to take lessons from Dr. Snider, who has taught professionalism in the military for many years, how to take these lessons into the Foreign Service. And I'm anxious to hear. We had a fascinating lunch at which he started this conversation. I would note that, this month is the 90th anniversary of the start of the professionalization of the Foreign Service, a process we're still going through. In May of 1924, Congress passed the Rogers Act, which amalgamated our consular service with our diplomatic service and created the modern professional foreign service. And that was the start of something that we're still continuing with. So, with no further ado, I'll introduce Rob, who will introduce our speaker.
Yes, thank you very much for coming out today. Desperate time is for everyone, but let me say a few things. So one, I wanted to also talk about the Professionalism and Ethics Committee in AFSA. It is the newest committee in AFSA, but a lot of foreign service people, members of associations, don't really understand or know about PEC. So I wanted to say a few things about PEC because I think that it is useful. I see Susan Johnson is here. She was her inspiration to create PEC. And we have with us today Ambassador Charles Ray. Charlie Ray has been the chair of PEC since it was created almost now 2 years ago. And we had the wonderful pleasure of working together in Hanoi. Well, I was in Hanoi and he was in Ho Chi Minh City, but sometimes we would be in the same location. I have found Charlie's been a total delight to work with Charlie these last 2 years. He also has this unique perspective of having served as a military officer, having served in Vietnam, having served as Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Department of Defense in the area of POW and missing personnel, a very, very sensitive issue, and also as U.S. Ambassador to Cambodia and Zimbabwe. And frankly, he is a leader and a professional in every sense of the word. So pleased to have him as our chairman. In PEC, we have had no shortage of issues. We've been busy examining ethical, professional, and educational issues confronting today's foreign service. And there are many such issues, and it is a very complex task. Research into the values of the foreign service required us to go to the field, and we developed some raw data that we've been working with on some of these kinds of things. So it's not all that sit in a room and write documents. Rather, we are engaged in the process of research. And when we got into this process, we began searching for what I would call a framework into which to fit this concept of how do you actually enhance professionalism. Where do you start? So it's a continuum, and where on that continuum are we? We looked to a number of classic professions for some sense of direction. We looked at the bar, the medical profession, the clergy. We examined codes of conduct of a number of professions, including those of a number of other foreign services around the world. And we've explored how the U.S. military orients, trains, and educates soldiers throughout their careers, how that might inform the departments in the Foreign Service's future. But a holistic concept of the elements of professions, frankly, eluded a lot of us. But thankfully, in our research, we learned of the work of the Center for the Army Profession and Ethics. That goes by the acronym CAPE. Curiosity, how many people are aware of the acronym CAPE? And over here, we do have with us Admiral Klein, U.S. Navy, and she's also working in the area of professions and enhancing professionalism. But what we also found was that at the core of CAPE, in many ways, the Center for the Army Profession and Ethics is a unique individual, Dr. Don Snider. And he has many titles. Right now he is Emeritus Professor of Political Science at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, which is also where CAPE is situated. And he's visiting professor at the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. I do want to point out that Dr. Snider has had two careers. He had a distinguished career in the U.S. Army. He was class of 1962 at the U.S. Military Academy himself, and he spent 3 combat tours in Vietnam. Very, very impressive special operations work, but also in a lot of planning work. He worked in the Office of the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He worked on the NSC, and also when he was getting his doctorate at the University of Maryland, he worked at CSIS, which we're all familiar with. His PhD was in public policy, and he spent 13 years in the Department of Political Science at the Military Academy at West Point, and also very, very deeply involved in this concept of civilian-military relations and development of leaders. So this is an absolutely key concept for us as we grow through this concept of how do you enhance professionalism in the Foreign Service. For the benefit of our Navy people here today, I do want to say one thing. I was a diplomat in residence in New York for a couple of years, and I went to a career fair at the University of Pennsylvania, and it was a very impressive black non-commissioned officer, and who was promoting the U.S. Navy at the University of Pennsylvania. And I went through the spiel. Oh, do you want to go in the Foreign Service? All you have to do is take this test and blah, blah, blah. And it's a pretty straightforward process. And you know, my spiel, as you were, would take a bit of a while, a bit of time. And then this Navy recruiter who was right next to me saw this very, very capable young man walk by, and he said one thing. He said, "Are you a leader? Are you a leader?" And the guy just stopped, and he said, and walked over to this guy. And before I know it, I think this guy was signed on, and probably at sea somewhere. But so we are here, and we will share in essentially the United States military has been working this issue for a long, long time, and I think that it provides insight and can inform us. And in that regard, we have Dr. Don Snider. So thank you. I turn it forward to Dr.
Thank you for the kind words. I have a daunting task today, so I'll get right to it. First, I would like to comment to most of you who I assume are associated with the Foreign Service Corps in some aspect, how respectful I am and my generation is of what you folks have done. As Rob helped me prepare for this, I was reading a number of things that you teach to your folks as you, and this little phrase from George Kennan really struck out at me. Nothing that I ever read in my experience in the military or in my teaching at West Point to the future leaders of the military. Kennan says, on the contrary, he's speaking now to foreign service officers, let us take special pride in the fact that we of this profession serve not because of, but in spite of the many popular attitudes by which our work is surrounded. It takes a special love of country to pursue, with love and with faith and cheerfulness, work for which no parades will ever march, no crowds will cheer, and no bands will play. So that is, to me, a remarkably concise statement of the quality of the work that your Corps has produced. And if I can, in some small way, based on the research we've done the last 10 years or so, help you think in a little different framework about what it means to be profession, and then I will be successful. That is my intent in coming here. I certainly do not know very much about your Corps. I speak to many groups who are desirous of being either professions or more professional than they are. So my role is to contextualize and give you a framework for what it means and how you can think about two things, profession and professional. Notice, I will not use the word professionalism. Like all isms, I learned in years of teaching and research in this field, that language doesn't communicate. You'll talk right by each other. Everybody has their own conception of professionalism. So I don't use the word. My research is focused at two levels. There are institutions, and they may be professions, and they may not. They may be businesses or bureaucracies, but that's one level of analysis. And then there's the level of analysis of the individual. So let me proceed. Here's my agenda. I want to cover 5 things. I'm going to leave you with 7 thoughts, and I have given myself about 40 minutes to do that, and then the rest of the time is for you and whoever you want to dialogue with you. Here's a start point. When we renewed the study of profession in the Army, and starting in 1999, and I say renewed advisedly, when the Army came out of Vietnam, let me assure you, Charles and I did not serve in a professional army. The Army was a draft army. It had been decimated in the war. We'd lost our NCO Corps. It was rife with ill discipline. It was behaving like a big government bureaucracy, that's all. So I have seen the Army re-professionalize itself. My generation in the officer corps did that. And by the time the Army fought the first Gulf War, particularly if you're interested in the history, read the history of the Battle of 73 Easting. In the first Gulf War, probably the finest example of armored warfare in the modern era, where one cavalry troop decimated an Iraqi regiment. So in 15 years, you can go from a non-professional status back to a highly professional status. It can be done. But there's no assurance. There's no assurance that once a profession, always a profession. The literature is quite clear. And if you don't believe that, just think of accountancy after Enron. And it's taken accountancy almost a decade. And major structural changes in the big 7 accounting firms, etc., and they have not yet restored themselves fully to the confidence of their client. So it's not the case of once a profession, always a profession. So when we started our research, 1999, it had been 30 years since the Army studied itself as a profession. So what did the Army do during that 30 years? We just wrote our doctrine and said the Army is a profession. Intellectually, not the right way to go. But we were busy rebuilding. There wasn't a lot of focus on it. We didn't have time to do that much studying. So by the end of the Cold War, the faculty at West Point, we were impressed. I was impressed. I'd been here at CSIS 5 years before. I'd done one book with some folks over at Johns Hopkins. I was convinced that the state of civil-military relations, the change in the military after the Cold War, said we better get a new grip on what it means to be a profession. So we used private foundation money to start the first 2 research projects in the 2 books that eventually were published on the future of the Army profession. When we went out to do the research, this is the answer we got from one of the majors. We traveled around the Army. We did survey data, quantitative, but we also did qualitative interviews, qualitative research, symbologic research. We asked the officer, said, come to the interview with something, an icon of your profession, that means that you are a professional. This officer came with nothing. So when you asked the officer, you know, the cab officers who came here brought spurs and black hats. The Special Forces people bought green berets because they were the only people allowed to wear berets in those times. Why didn't you bring a symbol of your profession? He said, well, I'm not a professional. I said, what do you mean you're not a professional? You're a transportation officer, you have the expert knowledge of networking, logistics management. He said, this was his response. How can I be a professional if there is no profession? And he said, I look around my unit, I look around the units that I'm associated with, and I don't see a profession. I see bureaucratic behavior, I see micromanagement, I see toxic leadership, I do not see a profession. Folks, this is critical. There's no history in America that we found in either of the research projects of a bureaucracy ever creating a professional. Professionals must be developed in a profession. Now that doesn't say they have to stay there all their lives. There are many complex organizations in America who use professionals as professionals and they're not in the profession. But if you look carefully, they were developed before they got there. Think of the Senate Armed Services Committee. a whole collection of professionals, law, military, functional experts. Pick them. Look at your own corps. Many people who were highly developed as professionals but are not serving in a profession. But they were developed as professionals before they went there. So the point here is, how can I be a professional if there is no profession? Now, for some of the younger folks in the audience, let me disabuse you of a misconception. I know this is the time of the year. We all watch hockey playoffs and basketball playoffs. And if you read the paper this morning, you know that LeBron had the worst playoff game in his history last night. Right?
I'm from Miami, so I'm in shock.
Oh, you're right. Is LeBron a professional?
I would hope so, next game.
He's being paid. He should be a
He's a
professional.
professional.
There
He's a
you go.
professional athlete. He has trained, he has taken part in studying of basketball and plays, and he has become physically
Okay.
fit. He's ready.
Now you know why I asked the question, because I vehemently disagree. He is an entertainer. He's a businessman. And the bottom line pays him, and his motivations come from a contract. Now he loves what he does, and he's very good at it. But in the way that I am using the word profession, I want to set the context very early. I'm not using the word professional as an antonym to amateur. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a professional in the sociology of professions. So you need to build this framework of how do Western democratic societies organize groups who are going to do highly specialized work for them. So let's talk about a social trustee profession. Here's what professions do, not basketball teams. This is what professions do. They provide a service which the society cannot provide itself, but must have to flourish. American people cannot cure themselves of disease, so they consider medicine a profession. American people cannot represent themselves before the bar, so they consider law a profession. American people cannot secure themselves in an interdependent world, so they consider the military a profession. Well, only recently, didn't originally. We'll talk about that later. So, expert work, society can't provide it, must have it. They work with abstract knowledge, and it's developed into human expertise. I don't care how much technology a professional works with. It is not the technology that makes the professional. It's the abstract knowledge in their head and their human ability to apply it, which we'll discuss later, which is the art of the professional. They have to maintain the trust of their society. There's only one currency for professions, folks. I know we're commodifying medicine, and we've commodified the law. But ultimately, there is one currency for a profession. That is the trust of the client. And the client will tell you if you're a profession or not. You don't get to decide if you're a profession in Western countries. The client will determine. And if they see you not behaving as a profession, then they'll treat you like some other organizational structure, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But the client gets to determine if you're a professional, and they'll make that judgment based on how effective and ethical you apply your expertise on their behalf. No professionals working for themselves. You're a servant of the society providing what they must have, and so you must do it on their terms, by their ethic. Of course, we like to say we have our ethics, but folks, if our ethics ever clash with your client's ethic, let me tell you who will win. And I can cite many examples of that. And if all of these things happen, then a social trustee profession is granted autonomy. Relative autonomy in their work. Nobody looks over the chief of staff or the Army shoulder and says, this is what you will write in your operational doctrine on mission command. Because nobody knows anything about it except the Army. And that's the way it should be. They trust us to write the right doctrine and develop it in our people. And that's the nature of professions. So we get autonomy. We're granted a good bit of autonomy. So that's what professions do. Here's the Army's case. You folks have a slightly different history for your professionalization, but the bottom line is at the bottom. The Army's existed since before the Republic, even before the Declaration. 239 years in Army, 122 years of profession. So what was it the rest of the time? If you look at the top line, the Army was organized, the Continental Army was first organized out of colonial militias. The colonial legislatures had to get together and agree and provide a Continental Army to George Washington well before the founding of the Republic. And those colonial legislatures controlled their militias right under their thumb. Go back and read some of the legislature's language. They'll tell you how many barrels of powder you get, how many rounds for muskets, how many boxes of hardtack. Absolute control, bureaucratic control, because the colonial legislatures did not trust the military. That was our heritage from the British. They were extremely distrustful of the standing military, so they would send their colonial militia, but they wanted it back and they wanted the big army disbanded when the war was over. And that was our history until the end of the Second World War. So, the whole point of this chart is one point. The Army, and I would submit the Foreign Service Corps, has two characters. You are an institution of two characters all the time. You are a governmental hierarchical bureaucracy, and you aspire to be a profession. So the rest of my discussion is going to be around the question of, well, what will determine if you're really a profession or not? Because you will always be a government bureaucracy. How do you get a government bureaucracy to behave as a profession is the essential question I'm going to be discussing from here forward. And you can obviously guess what the answer is: leadership. But we'll come to more of that in specifics. So let's contrast these two characters. This is probably one of the most important charts I will show you. Expert knowledge, non-expert knowledge. I'm not talking down to bureaucracies to say, and businesses to say that they use non-expert knowledge. I'm simply noting a qualitative difference. In the old days, medicine had phlebotomists. They'd take a blood sample, they'd put it under a microscope, they'd go back to the doctor and say, this is what I saw. How do you do that now? Lab, contractor. So here is a business using handed off old it used to be expert work, now it's non-expert work. When I get to this point in my briefing to Army officers, I say, have the stewards of the Army profession thrown out of the profession, which they must do every year, the old knowledge? Why are we investing in development of non-expert knowledge? And the example I use is, why does the Army still have a finance school? And inevitably, I upset somebody in the audience, always, who just served in the finance corps. But it's an honest question from a researcher. If I'm going to look at you as a profession, you should be throwing out the old expert knowledge as fast as you are bringing in the new, because you don't have enough resources or time to develop on non-expert knowledge. That's the work of your bureaucracy. Get it out. Contract it out. Make it a business. But whatever, do not try and make a profession out of non-expert knowledge. It won't work. Accepts lifelong learning. Notice, if you go to work 3 days in a row and do exactly the same things, you're behaving as a bureaucrat. You're not behaving as a professional. Every time a lieutenant goes outside of a forward operating base in an overseas deployment, we teach them by doctrine the essential elements of analysis they go through to know the difference between this mission and the last one. The enemy's changed, the train's changed, the time's changed, the weather's changed, your allies have changed. Constantly helping them focus on the difference. So professionals only deal with new situations. I'll come to this later. This is critical. I'll come to it later. There's only one measure of effectiveness. It is effectiveness. The sick want to be cured. I had a bout with cancer a few years ago. I was selecting a surgeon. How many of these surgeries have you done? How many people died? How many came out with condition A? How many came out with condition B? He just recertified for New York boards. He opened up his computer, showed me 608 surgeries. I said, you're the man. I trust you. Then he said, oh, by the way, because of your anatomy, part of the places I'm going to be cutting, I may not be able to see. And I said, excuse me, that's me you're cutting on. He said, I trained, I can distinguish cancerous tissue from non-cancerous for very short periods, if absolutely necessary. What was he asking me? Do you trust me? That's the currency of professions. And you know what? I didn't care what cancer surgery cost. I only use the measure of effectiveness. And I don't think I'm different than most other people seeking professional services. It's based on trust, and now we get to the critical part. Uh-oh. Your little clicker works amazingly well. Professions have an ethic, and it is self-policed. I'll cover this more later. But this is unique to professions. And why do they do that? It's because they know if they don't do that, they're going to lose the trust of their client. In professions, you want the very best professional serving the client, not some halfway professional. I didn't want a surgeon coming in the next morning that had been smoking on a joint the night before. That was just not what I was looking for. So self-policing, intrinsic motivations versus extrinsic, I'll cover that in more detail later. I want to focus here. What is a calling? In the Latin, vocare, what does it mean? To accept the calling, as opposed to a job, which is the contrast, as opposed to a job. A calling has one distinction to it compared to a job. The work that you do is more important than you are. That's it. If you cannot accept the intrinsic value of the work on behalf of society, then you're not following a calling. And it has to be more important than you are, or you're going to get your motivations mixed up. And you're going to start saying, what's in it for me? And in the military, we call that careerism. And they stick out like a sore thumb. They're in it for themselves. They're not in it for the mission. They're not in it for the higher call. Now, I'm overstating this. I'm going to state a lot of things very black and white today. I'm doing that for emphasis. Obviously, every time we make a decision, we have divided loyalties. All of us do. I'm trying to make distinctions here so you can understand, in some cases, it will be by overstatement, that, wow, there is a big difference between being called to your work and simply having a job that you really enjoy. Ron James enjoys his job. But in the sense, the original sense of calling, the sacredness of work, the value of the work, the whole society is depending on you to do it right. That is a calling. And that is a source of immensely powerful intrinsic motivation if you can create the culture in which calling can be manifested. So, we've talked about contrast between profession and bureaucracy. Now let me turn to profession, the level of profession. The literature on professions, and most of this we adopted from Andrew Abbott, University of Chicago, probably the leading theoretician in America today on professions and how professions work, systems of professions. He talks a great deal about jurisdictions. There are external jurisdictions outside. That's where you applied your work. These are the Army's 4 external jurisdictions. Our jurisdictions are negotiated. They were just negotiated in the QDR. You probably are renegotiating yours through some of your processes of what is the Foreign Service Corps going to be expected to do in the future. Then our leaders have to set the internal priorities, how much forward deployed, how much CT operations, how much defend the homeland, and how much in conventional to decisively defeat and deny. Let's set that aside. Those are functional areas of importance to all professions. But for today's discussion, it's the internal professions that I want to focus on, jurisdictions. Every profession has the same 2 jurisdictions: law, medicine, theology, higher education, maybe accountancy. First off, professions develop their own expert knowledge. When I research military professions overseas, and I go look at a foreign military and I say, is this a profession or is this a bureaucracy? I look for 3 things. And the first thing I look to see is what expert knowledge new have they created in the last 2 or 3 years? And if there's new expert knowledge there, they're just a big government bureaucracy. Professions create their own knowledge. The Army is very busy right now creating 2 new fields of expert knowledge that we don't know enough about, cyber war being the main one. We have to learn how to do that. What is it? How do you counter it? What are the offenses? What are the defenses? What are the coalitions? What's the technology? Constantly creating new expert knowledge. Medicine does that. The law is doing that. And the second thing you look for in a profession is, if there is new expert knowledge, how well are they developing that knowledge into the life of professionals? Because remember, knowledge in the abstract is useless. It's only knowledge that is going to be practiced by humans that is useful. So, 2 internal fields. I would ask you folks in your association, what is the expert knowledge of the Foreign Service Corps? Now in the Army, when we went through this process, believe it or not, in 1999 at West Point, when we did this process, I went to our biggest doctrine command in the Army and said, I want the map of the Army's expert knowledge. And you know what they gave me? They gave me a list of doctrinal manuals that went 129 long, about 20 of which hadn't been updated in 15 years. And I said, wait a minute, that may have been a map of expert knowledge at one time, that's not a map now. So a very bright, enterprising young PhD from Princeton, Army major, took on the project for us and did a detailed study of the Army's expert knowledge and mapped it into these 4 domains. First, there's the military technical knowledge. Now that's what you would think is all of the knowledge of the military. That's how you do offense, defense, logistics, supply, medical evacuation, training, all of the things that make the military the military. I'm going to have difficulty because my thumb is bigger than this little thing. Then there is the moral ethical field of knowledge. It is a separate field of knowledge. This is the knowledge of how you fight wars. This is the knowledge of how you fight wars rightly, the way the American people want them fought. That has an immense amount of implications for our profession. And frankly, it was one of the least modern fields. We had simply given the business to our chaplains. I won't go there. And we had largely ignored it. Political cultural knowledge. The more the military becomes involved in the kinds of wars that we're having now, the more we have to become culturally aware and able to deal with you folks, for one example, and all the other folks out there in the interagency and the gym environment which make the military necessity for new fields of knowledge quite different than they were in the past. And like you, much more language oriented. And then most critically, this, sad to say, in 1999 when we finished our first book, this was the weakest field of knowledge in the Army. And it should have been the strongest. It was the weakest field of knowledge. We went back and reviewed our leadership doctrines, and it wasn't just the leadership doctrines. We did not have a developmental doctrine in the Army. We did not have any place in the Army we could go to and read a manual that says, how does a soldier develop? They're a civilian here, you put them in basic training, and then they become a soldier, or you put them in West Point or in ROTC. How do they develop? Physically, intellectually, spiritually, emotionally. We don't have it. Some of those subjects are in the too hard box. We don't want to talk about them. We're too politically correct to discuss some of the subjects, particularly the spiritual development. And don't forget, in our profession, thank you, in our profession, there's only 4 reasons for having soldiers. To prepare to kill, and under right authority to kill. And if you're in the killing business, then you must be preparing to die, and if necessary, die. The mission and the work is more important than you are. That's the calling. That is an immense developmental task. And yet, the doctrine that we had of leader development was not up to what was necessary in this particular domain. We've improved it since 1999, but as you're reading in the newspapers every day, between the developmental domain and the moral ethical domain and the experiences of 12 years of war, we have a major task ahead of us. We have much work to do in restoring the character that we need to the professionals that we already have. They're competent, they're highly military technically competent, but some of the other absolute expert knowledge of the profession we are behind on. And that's one reason we've been working these projects. Finally, now let me move down to the level of the professional. This is the end of the introductory material. What's the practice of the professional? Please read it. It follows the things that I have discussed so far. When, based on their abstract expert knowledge in their head, notice, people in combat may have computers with them, but it's not a computer that gives them a formula for a decision they're going to make. It's technology that aids in the military technical part. It does not aid very much in the decision-making part. So based on their expert knowledge, facing a new situation, you classify, you use inferential logic from the abstract knowledge to the new situation, and then you act. What's this called? That's the diagnostic art. That's the same thing doctors do. Diagnosis is what military professionals do. They face a new situation, they apply their knowledge, they diagnose and act, they follow the action for effectiveness, and then they go back and change two things: expert knowledge and jurisdiction. What happened if the action they took failed? Well, something's wrong. Maybe we're in the wrong jurisdiction, maybe we don't have the right expert knowledge. And sure enough, every major in the Army has been reading the same doctrinal manual. So if it's wrong, we've got to change it for everyone. That's why in the military, the after-action review is such a big part of what we do. It's the way we get that constant feedback loop in the behavior of a profession. So what is the practice? The repetitive exercise of discretionary judgment. Now, I would submit it's the same in your work, largely. So let me ask you a question about your work and my work. How many decisions did you make when you were in the Foreign Service that had zero moral content to them? Zero. And I'm using the word moral to say that your decision influenced the well-being of another human being, a rather standard generic definition of moral. Now, you see where I'm going? If the practice of the military professional is the repetitive exercise of discretionary judgment, and I say repetitive, how many times a day do you think that happens? If you're in an operation or on patrol, or in an aircraft, or in the surface fleet, how many times do you think leaders in those levels are making decisions? 30 to 40 times a day at a minimum. No formulas, just abstract knowledge, inferential reasoning, decision, follow-up. And they're all of high moral content. What's the implication? We have to have professionals of high moral character. If we do not have professionals of high moral character, there is no way we can fulfill our responsibility to the society and to the client. And I'll come back to that later. So that's the practice of the profession. Why do we care if the Army is a profession or not? Why do you care if the Foreign Service Corps is a profession or not? Let me give you two reasons to think about it. The first reason is, as I mentioned earlier, professions create their own knowledge. If you're going to have the professional knowledge of diplomacy, I would submit you're going to need a professional corps to refine it and propagate it. If we're going to have the professional knowledge of land combat, you're going to need a professional army to develop it and refine it and move it forward. Secondly, the other reason it is essential that the Army be a profession is because professions have a unique method of social control. Professions use their ethics for social control. Bureaucracies don't do that. Bureaucracies use basically legalistic compliance mandates from the top down. That is not the form of the social control where a professional controls himself. Let me give you an example. Patton was commanding a division in North Africa. Young two-star. Guderian's Panzer Corps attacked. His lead regiment was routed. Utterly routed. Chaos, confusion, poor communications. Finally get the word in the division CP. The regiment is routed and fleeing. Patton reaches around, gathers up some of his classmates and some other folks, mount a few vehicles, and charge forward to stop the rout. They hadn't gone very far and they met the Germans. There wasn't much between them and the Germans. They stopped, took defensive positions. The Germans stopped, took defensive positions. Short standoff, the Germans withdrew. Patton wrote to his classmates back in the States under General McNair, who were preparing other divisions to be deployed. He wrote the following sentence to them. We did not turn and run from the Germans because we were more afraid of our consciences than we were of them. That's what I'm talking about. That is social control imposed on an individual by an ethic, an informed conscience. And that's what you need in foreign service officers, and that's what we need throughout the United States Army. Unlike what you read on the front page of the Washington Post today, of one more case of ill discipline and immoral behavior on the part of our leaders. So this is an immense challenge for professions, and it is immensely important that they have an ethic and that the ethic be developed in such a way that it becomes that powerful. That's what intrinsic motivation is as opposed to extrinsic motivation. So let me cover that a little bit now. I do want to cover one other point first. This is a quote from General Ordinero, who's now the Chief of Staff of the Army. What happens if professions don't behave as professions? What happened on March 2003, Baghdad? This is General Ordinaro's explanation of how he interpreted what was going on in Baghdad. When we went there, we thought we'd have a conventional fight. We had a conventional fight. They'd taken down Baghdad, which quickly turned into an insurgency that was compounded by terror. We were surprised. Excuse me? Why should a profession ever be surprised on the battlefield? But the United States Army was. By the changing tactics. We had no idea. We didn't recognize. And when we did, it took too long. I would disagree with the last statement. Done a lot of research on professions. The Army basically redesigned their doctrine of counterinsurgency and embedded it in majors and in battalions, which is the critical level at which you must embed it, in about 2 years. I know of no place that I've researched anywhere else that a military organization has gone from no expert knowledge and no practice. Remember, those two internal jurisdictions. No expert knowledge and no practice to, I got the knowledge, I recognize it, and I can practice it. The Army did that in about 2 years at an immense cost in blood of young Americans. Folks, that was an egregious failure of leadership by the stewards of the Army profession about 10 years before this. You have to look back. It takes time to create new expert knowledge. It takes time to develop it in people to practice. So the stewards who failed the Army were the stewards of the 92 to 95 to 96. And I'm not trying to, be down on people here. I'm simply pointing out to you there is an immense responsibility for the stewards of the profession, and you stewards of your profession need to be looking now at what expert knowledge and what practice much you have 5 to 6 years from now. Because it's going to take that long to get the knowledge development and get it embedded in people who can practice it automatically out of their head. So, there is an immense expense if professions do not behave as professions. That's the point to this. Okay, I'm going to treat this next section very quickly. I'll probably skip most of my slides because I want to spend more time on the ethic, and then I want to get to your questions. Suffice it to say, we did a major study on the Army coming out of the Cold War, the new center up at West Point. We answered 2 questions. What's it mean for the Army to be a profession? And what does it mean to be a professional? At that point, we were only 9 years out of the war. We went out to the Army and did a lot of field tests, a lot of data. Here's what we found. We wanted to measure trust. 2/3 said I trust members of my unit. 2/3 of the leaders said I can trust my subordinate. Only 25% agreed the Army allows candid opinions. Talk about micromanagement. Talk about top-down, heavy-handed leadership. People can make a mistake without ruining their career. Only 40% agreed. That doesn't sound like an open culture. That sounds far more like a bureaucracy than it does like a profession. There were commitments, mutual commitment issues. When a senior Army leader says something, you can believe it's true. 20% said no. Now, notice, the Chief of Staff told us to go do this study. He sensed what was out there. he and General Dempsey, this was General Casey. Casey and Dempsey, they used to use the phrase, we have soft signals. We have soft signals. That's the senior commander's way of saying, I have a pretty good intuition of what's going on. I got a lot of reporting coming into me, but I need somebody to connect the dots for me, and I need it done in the way that the whole Army is going to have to believe it. And that's what we were charged in doing in our study. So we looked at the trust issue, and it was not as strong as you would like it to be. We went out and we asked them, is it important to you that the Army's a profession? Oh, yes. Everybody said so. Is it important that you be a professional? Oh, yes. If the Army should be a profession, but we don't act like one, 2/3 agreed. So there we are. It's important to the individual. They would like to be a profession. They want to serve in a profession. And yet they could look around and fully 1/3 of the Army was telling us what the Major told us in 1999. How can I be a professional if I can't see the profession?
Is RC reserved?
Yes, excuse me. Yes, we did the whole Army, ma'am. Yeah, that's the National Guard, the whole Reserve Corps. So here were our conclusions. We didn't have a doctrine on the Army. We couldn't even have a conversation on the Army and what it means to be a profession because we had never written the doctrine of profession. And I'll show you on the next slide what we decided. We pulled out just a few things that we believe are essential to being a profession. Obviously, we had difficulty in the moral ethical domain. Obviously, there was lack of confidence in some leaders. We had trust issues. I just showed you the data. Certification. I'll give you one slide on that later. It is a major issue in professions. Folks, if you're not certifying, you're not behaving as a profession. Let me give you the aphorism in the literature. Bureaucracies promote, professions certify. That's it. If you have nothing but a promotion system, you're behaving like a bureaucracy. If you have a certification system that bases advancement fully on a range of certifications, then you're behaving like a profession. And you know, what we found out in the study was the people most upset about this were the people that we were not certifying. They came back to us and said, I want to be certified. It tells me how good I am. It tells me what you will expect of me, and it gives me the pride that I have met your standards. And we were so busy churning, going back and forth to the war, that we had just dropped certifications significantly. So, we had trouble with our own educational system, a lot of deferments, a lot of people going back and forth to the war and opting out of educational. Obviously, we had discipline problems. So what are some of the things we addressed? This is an important chart to the military. I offer it to you as an exercise in kind of mental discipline. If you're going to think about the Foreign Service as a profession, what are the very few essential characteristics that must exist? Now, when we started this study, we listed the essential characteristics of the Army profession. How many do you think we had?
25.
Yeah, it was a pretty big number. I think 21. I mean, it was big. It was, you know, I've worked on study groups in the Pentagon. I've worked on study groups at a lot of different places. I directed research at CSIS for 5 years. I mean, you can put a committee together and you can boil yourself with good ideas. But that doesn't mean that the synthesis is a good idea. Finally, we came down to 4 essential characteristics which would produce the 5th. We decided that for the Army, given the fact that it's always going to be a big bureaucracy, those things that bureaucracy could not do and would never demonstrate were the things that the profession had to demonstrate. First, military expertise. That's what defines us. The ethical application of land combat knowledge. Second, we had to have a culture that allowed people, to exercise calling, to service and sacrifice. That is an immense challenge for leadership, to establish and maintain, but only the stewards can do that. Only the senior leaders. So if we had honorable service and military expertise, and we could have a winning spirit, think of the Ardennes, think of the small unit operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, where people have been getting the Medal of Honor for amazingly heroic things, the ability to be resilient in the worst of circumstances. if we had those three things plus stewards who understood what it meant to be a steward and were not spending all day shooting 25-meter targets. Remember, a steward shoots the 100-meter target 5 years down the road. Make sure you got the right expert knowledge. The strategic leaders can't be back here. We needed to renew the concept of strategic stewardship in the profession. We figured that if you had those four, then you would have trust, the fifth, between soldiers, soldiers and leaders, families, and with the American people. So that's it. That's the framework we came up with. My question to you is, what's the comparable framework for the Foreign Service Corps? I'm confident we got this right. This was a big study, but I am confident after a number of years of researching in this field that if the Army will get these four things correct, we will create more trust, both internal and external. And there will be a high probability that the whole institution will be perceived as profession and not as bureaucracy. So I offer that to you as an example. That's one of the things that came out of the study. The other thing that came out, and this is another idea for you, we went back and looked at the identities. We're not strong on identities in the Army. The Marine Corps is marvelous with identities. Once a Marine, always a Marine. They know what it means to be a Marine. And it communicates, and more importantly, it motivates. Soldier, well, the greatest generation, yes, but soldiering has always had a little bit of an identity. So we're now trying to work on smaller identities: military expert, honorable servant, steward. 3 identities for all soldiers. We have to fulfill all 3 of them all the time, even though some may be more important than some jobs. But you must consider yourself a military expert and be expert. You must be a servant. Frankly, we chose the word servant intentionally. We must counter the hyper-individualism coming out of American society. When they come into the service of the Republic, they have to understand that they're not that important. The Republic is. Now that's hard, and that's becoming increasingly more difficult. So for identity-based development systems, we specifically chose identity of servant, and then renewing the strategic level of stewardship. So identities, certification, we now certify in 3 things. During the war, we primarily certified in competence. We were grinding units back and forth. A unit would come out of Afghanistan and Iraq, put it back on its home base, put a new group of leadership into it, replenish the enlisted corps, put it through another training cycle, and oftentimes in 6 months it was back in theater. The total focus was on competence. We were not certifying in character, and we were not certifying in commitment. So we have work to do in both of these, and we know that, and the new doctrine makes clear that we now certify, and we've already changed a number of evaluation systems. In my judgment, probably not enough, but we're starting. So certification, trying to get beyond the idea that all you do is promote. This is not about promotions. This is about certifications as a professional and the motivations that go with them. And if we get those 3, we will have trust. I want to go to the ethic and then conclude. What does an ethic do? I've already told you. It basically is a means of social control. An ethic is a factor in motivation. It's a factor in human development, the motivational aspects of human development. And that's what we're after. Our ethic distinguishes the profession from the remainder of the society. I mentioned, we're a unique profession. We're in the killing and dying business. And our ethic has to deal with the killing and dying business. It's the internal guidance for individuals, for institutional behavior, and for the moral development of professionals, something that we have been unwilling to talk about for the last 10 years. Partly because of the press of time, partly because, in Don Snider's opinion, some of those subjects are just a little sensitive. We just don't like to talk about moral failure until we see it on the front page of the newspapers all the time, and now we have to talk about moral failure. And that reminds us we would have been much wiser to have talked about it earlier, the way that we are now. So that's what the ethic does. Here's a way to think about the ethic. I would offer this for your own thinking of your own ethic. First off, an ethic is nothing more the underlying beliefs at the core of the institution's culture. That's all the ethic is. Culture comes at three levels. The bottom level of institutional culture are basic underlying assumptions. Above those are moral principles, and above those are the icons that we all relate to about our ethic. One icon, for example, is your oath. You can read it. It's real. It's tangible. I can see that. That's an icon of a much deeper underlying assumption of what it means to be a servant serving the Republic. So that's what the ethic is, and the ethics are not static. I've had great difficulty teaching this in the Army the last 10 years. We have a lot of people who in the Army think, well, we've always had an ethic and it's not changing. It's just an ethic. The Army's got an ethic. No, ethics change. And Tony Hartle wrote a book on how ethics change over time, military ethics. First off, the functional imperatives of the profession are one measure of our ethic. We have certain things in our profession, and I would submit you do too when you think about it. We have certain things in our profession that must be a part of our ethic because of the nature of what we do. You may not be obese and be in the Army. We have an ethic of physical fitness. An ethic of physical fitness that says you are responsible for your physical fitness. We'll help you, but you own it. And if you don't own it, you're going home. And if you're too obese, you're not coming in to start with. So I'm only using one example. But there are functional imperatives around weight, height, eyesight, cognitive capabilities. If you can't pass the AFSA, you can't get into the military. Today, 22% of the high school graduates are eligible for the Army. I didn't say 22% of the kids in America. I said 22% of the high school graduates. Obesity is the major issue. So there are functional imperatives that influence the ethic. There are cultural norms that influence the ethic. And obviously the one we've been through most recently is the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And now we're going through another one with opening more combat positions to women. And those are evolutionary changes in an ethic. Why? Because we serve a society, and we have to serve according to their values, and they have to recognize that in some places they don't get their way because there are imperatives to the profession if you want to have an effective Army. That's why in the first chart I gave you negotiated jurisdictions. That's what the stewards of the profession have to do. They got to go up on the hill and negotiate, and they better be persuasive. And if the stewards of your profession can't be persuasive, you're going to wind up with a skewed ethic. And of course, we're all bound by laws and treaties. So, the whole point of this is, do you understand your ethic as evolving? Can you identify the major influences on it? Do your stewards know what they are? So then we came to the real problem for the Army. The real problem in the Army is we don't have an ethic written anywhere in short, concise form. We got 40 or 50 ethics. Codes, creeds, constitutions, oaths. So we took all these ethics as part of this writing of the doctrine. I had done a monograph on this earlier. We took all these ethics and we put them in a quad chart, and we said, well, some of our framework for our ethic is legal, it's codified. And some of it is about the Army as an institution. The Constitution, Title 5, 10, 32 for active guard civilians. Treaties, status of forces agreements, law, land warfare. It's institutional and it's legal. And we got other legal that influence individuals. The most common one being Uniform Code of Military Justice. The one that should be most common are the Standards of Exemplary Conduct, a remarkable document written almost 180 years ago. But we also have moral foundations to our ethic, and this is critical. And this is an area that the Army had, in Don Snider's opinion, was beginning to lose touch with. We have legalized the military profession in the last 12 years of war. More than probably we should have. That's my comment, my assessment. And a lot of that was because of the nature of the war and the way we had to fight the war and the fact that the war is so visible to everyone and that all acts of ill discipline are so easily, the concept of the strategic corporal. So yes, there have been a lot of reasons that commanders have been much more legalistic in making decisions. But ultimately, commanders have to rest on discretionary judgment, and much of that judgment must be moral. Remember, your moral code tells you to disobey a legal order. We can never let combat soldiers forget that, because it's not the case that every order they're going to get is going to be moral. And they've got to distinguish and say, time out, I'm not doing that. And here's the reason I'm not doing it. Let's rethink this together and see if we can't get this legal order to also be a moral order. So what are the moral foundations? The Declaration, just war tradition about when we go to war and how. The Army's got some moral things in its culture. Its can-do attitude, the concept that Bastogne, you know, I don't care how many Germans there are out there, I don't care how many people are freezing to death, we're not giving up. And they didn't give up. Intrepidity, that's a moral concept, that's not a legal concept. So there are moral foundations to our ethic. Accepted human rights, golden rule of interpersonal behavior. Every soldier comes into the Army with a personal morality. Do we ask them to leave their morality at the door when they come in the Army? Well, some people today would say we almost are at that point. That the secularization of our society and the hyper-individualism of our society is leading in that direction. I argue strenuously against that. I just completed a long monograph on the subject. On the absolute essentiality in the concept of profession, that every professional be able to live a life of conscience under their own personal morality. The challenge is they have to integrate it with this ethic. They've got to get it sufficiently integrated that they can abide by the institutional ethic, but we are not asking them. How can we call them leaders of character? What is character? See, this is where the services, the Army in particular, has got itself in a trick box. We write our doctrine about leaders of character, and we say of character means that's who you are in your personal essence. Well, doesn't that include your personal morality? Of course it does. How can you be authentically true to self? If they say, well, leave your personal morality at the door. We all abide by this ethic. Well, of course we all abide by this ethic. But we're not asking you to leave your morality. Because there may be times, very important times, when your personal morality is in fact more important to your character than the institutional ethic. Now these are sensitive subjects. But what we're trying to do by this is create a framework within which we can talk about it. Remember the two big questions we were told to answer. What's it mean to be a professional? What's it mean to be a professional? This is about the construction of moral meaning. That's human development. By most behavioralists, that is known as learning. That's what we're attempting to do here in this process, is create frameworks within that can happen. And here we're trying to create moral frameworks and ethical frameworks that are both legal and moral. But we haven't broken the code. We now have a study group that's working trying to write a short, accessible, what's the phrase? Concise, accessible, well, no, we've got a particular Army jargon phrase for it. And we're struggling mighty to get a single statement of our ethic, and we don't have one.
You mean a mission statement?
No, not a mission statement. We know what the moral purpose of the Army is. We have that. We want something that we can use to motivate soldiers to honorable service. It's going to have to include an identity component. What does it mean to be a soldier? Who are you? And then it's going to have to be not only who are you, but because of who you are, this is how you do things. We've got several drafts, but I'm not sure any one of them is going to see the light of day yet. And incidentally, we're not the first people to try and do this in the Army. I want to make a couple of final points here. I mentioned to you earlier, the ethic is the means of motivation. What kind of motivation are we after? Notice the motivation that you get out of the legal side of the ethic. This is the motivation of obligation. I am obligated to do my duty. The duty concept comes in here. The duty concept is a powerful concept. But the duty concept, under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, has been legalized. Because we have an article in the Uniform Code of Military Justice that you can be charged with dereliction of duty if you don't do your duty. So the only motivation that can come from that is one of, well, I'm obligated. This is old motivational theory, folks. This is old leadership theory. This is transactional leadership. Punishments and rewards. How long ago did transactional leadership go out? Well, the Army went out about 15 years ago. We're now using transformational leadership models. Authentic leadership. Leadership that intends to inspire by seeking the aspiration of the individual. If we can get the person to want to become the identity that we develop for them, if they can own that, and does this sound familiar, parents? Isn't this the process of parenting? I mean, it's the same social psychology. You do one developmental process for adolescents, we're working on a developmental process for adults. So the process has to come out a little bit differently, but the model is not. So this is what we're after. We want the motivation of aspiration. Two different motivations out of the ethic. Final point. How do you use the ethic? What are the weak points in using the ethic? Most of you are probably familiar with, this is James Rest. Here are the 4 stages of processing a moral decision. We have to develop our leaders in the Army so that first they can recognize the moral content of the decision. If you can't recognize the moral content of the decision, there's no way in the world you're going to make a moral decision. You might happen onto it, but it will not be made on a moral basis. So the first is recognition. The second is the process of moral reasoning or moral judgment. I don't know how you teach your professionals to do this. We're now teaching in the Army 3 frameworks for reasoning. And we encourage people to use all 3 and not to rely on one. And it may well be the case that 3 processes of reasoning will bring out different answers, and then you're going to have to really decide. The first one's deontological. Simply follow the rules. The rule prevails. That's deontology. The second is consequentialist, matching ends and means. That's a dangerous methodology because you can get caught in the trap that the end justifies the means. And the third is a virtue-based, ariological method of reasoning. We're trying to teach, or attempting to teach, at multiple levels throughout the Army that when you get to this part in moral decision-making, these are the models by which you, and then we get to the critical point. So now you've gathered all the information, you've looked at the moral content, you've reasoned about it, and you think you have a right choice, and now you have to apply your personal intentions to it. Your own moral intentionality. And folks, that is where the Bathsheba syndrome appears. I assume you've read that article. Well passed around most professional services. Clint Longnecker, the professor who wrote the article in the Harvard Business Review, is just, we now have him lecturing every year at the Army War College. It's a marvelous presentation. So what happens when you get to this critical point of moral intentions? Well, this is what it looks like. This is a diagram put together by a student at the War College who wrote a paper, did a research, a master's thesis last year that I was advising. And I said, you know, so you've got this thing down to the crucial point. I want to see your visualization of, well, what is the crux of a moral decision? And the crux of the moral decision is your character. And that's the fulcrum on which you're going to decide. Is your character more influenced by these elements of your human nature? Or is it more influenced by these elements of your human nature? Which is going to prevail? This is a tension between moral courage and moral cowardice. And when's the last time you saw a major profession writing about moral cowardice? We don't. We're starting to now. We got to get back to this subject. We got to call it what it is, and we got to talk about it. It is moral cowardice. What happens at the critical decision point, at the final decision point? The moral intentionality of the decision maker usually swings on the following questions. Am I going to weight the institutional equities, or am I going to weight my personal equities? One of the greatest challenges for leaders and professions is to take themselves out of the decision. I gave a eulogy for a 3-star at the Cadet Chapel at West Point, and I could honestly say, in the last 10 years of his life, and I had served with him very high places. I could not recall a decision he made that he was a part of the decision. And I thought hard about whether I really wanted to put that in his eulogy or not. But I did, because it was absolutely true. He was not that way his whole life. But late in his life, he got to the point that decisions were always about everything other than himself. The institution, the institutional equity, the mission, the people. That's what we're after. That's the final point. I don't think you can read a headline in the Washington Post in the last 2 years of all of the states of moral failure in the military. I'm unconvinced that any one of those people did not know what was right. They knew what was right. They chose to do what was wrong. And why did they choose? The psychologists have got all sorts of theories about this. Moral fading is one of the principles. Well, they had this great framework, but it just faded. You're right, it faded. Cowardice prevailed. And the reason cowardice prevailed, I believe, is because of the inherent nature and development of their character. So who's responsible for developing individual character? That's my final point. My final point is, the responsibility of development of individual character of a profession is a mutual responsibility between the institution and the individual. And we need to have explicit ways of talking about that and doing it and certifying it. So our work agenda is immense, folks. We got a lot of work to do. And what I just articulated for you is one of the biggest pieces of our work agenda. So that's it. What's transferable? One summary chart. Here's what I think you folks should be thinking about in your framework as you think the future of your profession. You need to think about, are you a profession or are you just a group of experts? Maybe it's the case that you're not a profession. I'm not here to judge. There are many organizations that are highly expert, effective organizations, but they're collections of experts. They don't have the trust relationship with society, etc., etc. So you need to think about the two jurisdictions, the stewards do. You need to think about your expert knowledge. What are your fields of knowledge? Expert practice. We had a big debate in our project, who's in the profession and who isn't. We had an immense debate about whether Army civilians were to be included. Because at no time previous in Army history, first off, we never had a doctrine of profession, but even in what little doctrine we had, we never discussed the Army Civilian Corps as professionals. We are now. They're included. For one simple reason. We now know after 12 years of war, we cannot fight a war without them, and we need them to be just as professional as the rest of the Army. So that said, it's in our institutional interest that they become highly professional. You've got to talk about developmental identities, you've got to talk about an ethic, and this is the critical one. What are the developmental systems that connect these two jurisdictions and connect this identity to the motivation of the ethic? How well do the developmental systems work, a part of which is certifications? So for my research, that's what I would think might be a helpful framework for you folks to think about. So what are your questions? Please.
Susan Johnson. I have a question about the stewards. I have many questions, but what I'll throw out is about stewards. How do you define the stewards? Like, what are the criteria for eligibility? Do they have to have the formal leadership position? Because in our case, the majority of our senior leadership of our agency are political appointees, short-termers, etc. So I'm just asking, what's the definition of who can be a steward?
Yeah, well, you notice I didn't give you a definition because we had an immense debate about this in our year of study. Let me give you the two schools of thought. Remember, I said there are three identities. Steward of the profession is one of the three identities, and we want everyone to have that identity. But admittedly, the junior ranks within the military really don't have enough influence to be stewards. The steward of the profession, I have written in several different places that I've written this, are essentially defined by rank, because rank gives you authority and responsibility to do what must be done to make the Army a profession. Ask yourself the question, Who controls the big muscle movements of the Foreign Service Corps? Who's going to determine the future of it? The people, the accessions, the promotions, the knowledge. Who are they?
We're not foreign service.
That's not exactly.
Well,
There's the problem.
some of them may be,
Some of them.
some of them may not be.
Yeah.
We have stewards in our profession that are not all wearing uniforms. We have political appointees in the Secretariat. They are as much stewards of the profession, and we have to lead up. We have to teach them. We have to socialize
Do
them.
they have to want to be stewards? Do they have to recognize that?
Of course.
Responsibility?
And if they come into our culture, and they're in our culture for a long time, and we haven't influenced them culturally to think that we're probably doing some things reasonably correctly, and they ought to get on board, then shame on us. But my point is, stewards of the profession are the people who control the large human resource programs that make the profession quintessentially a human institution. Remember, it's practiced by humans. The decisions are discretionary judgments by humans. Who controls the development of those people? The accessions, the annual certifications. Those are the stewards because they have the most influence over the future. In the Army, we have a stratified education system. We do not consider majors at Leavenworth in the third level of school to be stewards of the profession. We're teaching stewardship of the profession at the War College to the lieutenant colonels who are going to be colonels and generals. So that gives you some indication. However, I was just out at Leavenworth lecturing to 460 majors, and I had to look them right in the eye and say, look, we have to consider all of you stewards of the profession. The minute you are called to the profession, you become a steward. It goes with it. This job is not a job anymore. This is not about me anymore. I'm now devoted my life to this institution and its cause. And in that sense, they became a steward at that point. But we both know that without certain ranks and authorities and responsibilities, you just don't control the big issues. As a research item, let me suggest, that reminds me of something I wanted to suggest to you. An excellent research, which we've done a lot of on this idea of profession, is when you're doing workshops with junior professionals, or when a few seniors are working with junior professionals in the mentoring process. Ask yourself the question, when did I recognize that I was a professional? At what point? When was it? And then ask yourself another question. What was it in that situation when you recognized that you were a professional? What was it that triggered the event? I would submit, in most of those recountings, what you're trying to recount is, when was I called? When did I recognize this is not about me, it's about something bigger than me? I'm going to do this. I really like it. I would submit in my work and workshops with that, in almost every case, when the story comes out, when the vignette comes out, there is an exemplar involved. There is another human being professional who was a role model of such power that you said, I get it now. Now I see what it looks like in human form. So I would suggest that, some research on callings can be immensely powerful in helping you parse out, well, what are the identities and what is it that really does call people? I understand your demographics are immensely different than ours. Your accession demographics are different than ours. We enter most of our people at 22, 23. I think you said your mean point was 31 years. I mean, I understand there are immense differences here. But yet the framework of profession, these ideas, these are the essential. This applies to law, to medicine, but notice, this does not apply to businesses, and this does not apply to bureaucracy. I'm talking about professions.
Okay. Personnel and personnelists now claim professional status. To what degree has the military relinquished its formation and its development to another entity, personnel, equivalent in the State Department of the Bureau of Human Resources, as opposed to retaining a responsibility and a role, an active role in that same function. For what it's worth, my observation would be that we turned over that function a long time ago, either because people weren't interested or we were too pressed for resources or it wasn't a good promotion track or whatever, but I'm trying to understand how you get that balance and what have you learned from the military in that regard?
What we've learned in the military is that we have ebbed and flowed on this issue. And the last 12 years of war really ruptured a lot of processes. As I mentioned, we were just moving on competency, reorganizing units and getting them back into the battle. And so many of our human resource programs that we had relied on for these developmental systems, many of them were pretty significantly ruptured. Let me explain to you what I mean. Our developmental system rests on 3 legs. To make a military professional, we have to have 3 different sets of activities combined correctly in their developmental sequence. Number 1, it takes some amount of education. There is cognitive content to being a professional. So we have 4 schools that we're privileged to put people through. I understand that you don't have that much time, but in a 24-year career, our people can expect 4 years in school. So there is education. Secondly, as with all professions, most of the development occurs through experiential learning. Remember, professions use tacit knowledge. The education is not teaching the knowledge of action, it's teaching the prior knowledge. The knowledge of action is experientially learned. It's tacit knowledge. You have to go do it. You have to fail a few times. Remember, there is no, in the metacognitive structures, there is no reordering in your mind if you're only having success all the time. Failure is an immense teacher if we can capture it and go through the guided reflection that it takes to make it work. So education is one leg of our developmental processes. Experiential learning, but experiential learning only works well if you have time to mentor. Remember,
And
it's
process.
What?
Mentor and process.
Mentor and process. It's reflective learning. So, formal education, experiential learning, and then we're relying increasingly now on extended forms of self-study. Electronically, we can do an awful lot. I mean, people going into basic training now get a smartphone that has 20 apps on it. They have to develop themselves on an awful lot of skills. All we will do is test them on to make sure
But you do test.
Oh yes, oh yes. Make sure that they make it to standard. So back to your question, I think we have ebbed and flowed. What I just described for you is a developmental process that has 3 components to it. I'm not sure that we're comfortable right now that we have the right 3 components. We know that we have to go back within our military leaders and get them much more back into the business of mentoring and doing reflective counseling and the things that must be done for that experiential learning part to be as powerful as it was before.
If I may just follow up, to what degree, let me see if I can phrase it another way, to what degree is it essential that practitioners or even master practitioners be involved in this kind of work?
I mean,
that's the gap that we're facing.
Yeah, I understand, and it's the gap we faced for the last 12 years, and I think what we've learned is that we just lost sight of how essential it is. Mm-hmm. I mean, let's face it, if you're doing experiential learning and you're not being mentored with guided reflection, you don't have AARs, you can't do the feedback, you're processing the ignorances. You know, you're just going forward that way. That is not developmentally sound. So this is critical. These developmental systems, you can have a lot of the other things of profession. If you don't have these developmental systems to connect institution to individual, boy, it's going to be very hard to develop a profession. You might think you're doing it right up here, and you might think you're getting the right output down here, but the things that connect it are these developmental processes, and some of ours atrophied during the wars. Yes, ma'am.
Maura Connolly. I would like to go back to your chart where you compare profession versus the bureaucracy. Mm-hmm. And it struck me that some of the characteristics on either side also could be used to describe a generational divide that the Foreign Service is dealing with. We have a big bulge of new intake and not so many of the older generation still in the service. And I'm wondering, is that because of the different ways we have been trained in our own service to view some of those generational differences as sort of cultural differences from one generation to the next? Or is it because the newer people haven't yet been developed in the profession? Do you have a view on that?
Yes, it's the latter. I'm not one of, maybe I'm biased, I will admit. I spent a lot of years working and redesigning the developmental process at the military academy. And I believe in it. We can develop leaders. It's not rocket science. We need not be afraid of these processes. We need to be frank and open and talk about them, and particularly moral development. But we have plenty of people in America coming into the service who want to be good people and want to do good work. It's our challenge to make the developmental system so that they can be good people and can do good work. So I'm not, there are some significant generational differences. One of the significant problems that we have in the military, the hyper-individualism, and in what goes with hyper-individualism is an unwillingness to accept a non-toleration aspect to an ethic. Remember, we want an ethic which creates a meritocracy, a self-policing meritocracy. Many people in the younger generation view a self-policing meritocracy as, well, you're just ratting on your friends. Well, yes and no. What is the price of not ratting on your friends? Your whole institution is less effective. Your unit is less cohesive. You're endangering yourself. So it's a little easier to have a self-policing meritocracy when you're in combat, and people can see that very quickly, if this unit loses its effectiveness, I'm jeopardized. Now as we're moving back to garrison, we're finding that we're back to the hard territory again. So, no, we're not trying to say we want you to rat on someone. What we want you to do is to help them be better. But this goes back to the studies of cohesion. What is cohesion? Social cohesion and task cohesion. Those are two different things. And you may get social cohesion and not have task cohesion. It's more difficult to get task cohesion. So, yes, there are some cultural differences. And I just mentioned one, non-toleration, hyper-individualism. But I don't see others that are really obstacles.
So
Challenges, yes.
we would be going wrong if we were to analyze those differences purely in the generational context.
I think so. I don't think you want to go there, because you're writing off the generation. I don't think you can do that. I've met too many that are too good.
And you're writing off a profession.
Perhaps.
Ultimately.
Yes.
Well, with respect to the generational question, one thing we hear about a lot nowadays is the new generation does not view careers as lifetime. They view them as sequential jobs and activities.
Correct.
If that's true, to what degree then can you, if that is true, can you have professions anymore?
First off, it is true. If you folks want to go back and look at a survey that just came out last week, the Harvard Institute of Politics published their annual youth survey last week. And I was utterly shocked by the level of trust in the military. You know, we keep reading these Gallup polls and other polls, and they poll the whole American public and say, what's the most trustworthy in public sector institution? And usually the military is on top and Congress is on the bottom, and everybody laughs. And sorry that happens, but
Sorry to laugh.
well, it's not a healthy situation. That's my point. But the military kind of takes some comfort in that fact. So now we get a poll that came out last week on the millennial generation. And their youth survey is only millennials, 18, 29. I think 18 to 29, which incidentally, I taught another course on this. The millennial generation is now so predominant that most textbooks in sociology and in developmental psychology have been rewritten to include a new developmental stage between adolescence and adulthood. Are you studying it? this new generational stage, delayed adulthood, it's called a lot of different things. It's basically characterized by taking longer to get through school, taking longer to get married, taking longer to have children, some higher percentage returning home to parents. So it's a delayed transition from what we used to know as adolescence to adulthood. Well, that is now making up our armed forces. And very shortly we'll be making up your Foreign Service Corps. And in the poll that just came out, one thing that was very clear, their respect for the military is unlike the respect of society, because the military came out at less than 50%. 47% of only a plurality respect the military. So what we don't know is that anti-institutionalism, which we know is there elsewhere in the survey, or is that specifically directed at the military qua the military? We don't know. I don't know. I couldn't find that in the survey data. I couldn't understand it.
Can you build the military?
Well, let me put it this way. We are. Let me give you the rest of the data. The Army is now 66% millennial. Does that shock you? The Marine Corps, with a flatter structure, is 88% millennial. So we're making an army out of millennials. I mean, the question is not whether we want to or not. We're going to. We have to. That's what we're getting.
And you're gonna redefine.
You're making an army, but are you making a profession?
I'll tell you in a few years. No, I'm not one of these that says, remember, I told you, I came out of Vietnam when we were definitely not a profession. I was part of the generation that rebuilt the Army as a profession, won the Cold War, won the first Gulf War, and then went through the second build down I went through. And in that post-Cold War build down, we lost 37% total obligational authority, 35% manpower. And we took a hit in the quality of the profession. And now we've had 12 years of war, and we're going through another build down, which we don't know the size of. So the task to keep it a profession is a daunting one. I'm not here to tell you the Army's got this thing all locked up and we know what it is to be a profession, we're going to be one. My message to you is, we've spent 2 years studying this now, we're scrambling like mad, and I'll tell you in about 10 years what it looks like. And you know what I'll go to look at in 10 years if I'm still around? Are they creating new expert knowledge? Are they developing that practice into new professionals? And is it being applied by an effective ethic?
And do we have stewards?
Well, I will answer that question implicitly. If I find those three things, there are stewards.
Sort of question that narrows the field a little bit. You're speaking of the Army as a profession, I served in it. But within the profession, there are other professions. You mentioned the finance.
Yes, yes.
And it's my understanding that no signal corps officer will ever command an infantry battalion, nor will any artillery officer ever take care of the signal corps battalion. So that you have professions within, and to command an infantry division, you have to be an infantry officer. Is that correct?
Almost always. We've now broken the rule a few times. Yeah. Yes, we have many sub-professions within our larger profession. And this is a challenge for us, and I would submit, based on what little I've read about your service, it may even be a bigger challenge for you. Because the deal is that the identity of the professional is more strongly created in the sub-profession than in the large profession. In other words, does a special forces officer who strongly identifies with special forces and their mission, etc., to what extent is he also of the same degree loyal to the larger Army profession? So sub-professions are an issue, and the way you have to deal with sub-professions is you have to create a larger identity. That's why identity-based development systems are so critical. If you can't get a powerful identity at a high enough level with a large enough reach to the motivation, then it's going to be hard to make a profession.
Do you think the Army has done that? I mean, I think the Marines have.
Oh, the Marines have, clearly have, but they have the luxury of being so much smaller. I mean, we look at the Marines with envy.
People I know, I think that sub-professionals.
We still have a lot of sub-professions. I agree with you. But I am more sanguine now than I have. I've been associated with the Army now for, what, 53 years? 53, 54, I don't know. I walked on the plane in 1958 at West Point, right off the farm in Ohio. And so I've seen it go through a lot of, I'm more sanguine now on the larger issue other than at the end of the Cold War. At the end of the Cold War, we all knew that we were riding a wave and that we had an exceptionally, highly disciplined professional army. I mean, that was, you could feel it in almost every unit. It's been the height of the Cold War in Europe, 81 to 84. And we started deploying the Persians and the other big systems, and we broke the back of the 2nd Echelon Guards Army. It was very apparent that land power had manifested itself in a very professional way. Please.
My name is Al Laporta. In the Foreign Service, we have a very strongly held tradition of managing up, but not managing down. That's just an observation. But one word that you haven't used in any of this context is loyalty. Is that a word that should be banished from our jargon, or is it relevant because people still feel that as an emotion?
It's absolutely relevant. Loyalty is, and it's more than relevant. It is totally pervasive, because the problem is we have conflicting loyalties. We have too many loyalties. And so what these 8 things will, and I had the transferable chart, what they will help you sort out, I think, is which loyalties are most important loyalties. And this is human nature. We're not going to change this. People are always going to have conflicting loyalties. But we have to help them organize those loyalties in ways that are effective for what the institution is trying to do. No, as we're rewriting the ethic and trying to get it down to 1 page, loyalty is very common, I will assure you. One more, yes.
So Sharon Engelmeyer, used to my class in 2003. You're on a fellowship right now, so
Good.
it's very interesting.
Did I teach you?
Would have remembered, definitely.
What was your major?
International Strategic History. I minored in civil engineering.
Ah, no. History and engineering. I probably would not have seen that.
But this is definitely spot on, and I really appreciate your candor here. My question is, as we're talking about the generational gap and being able to transform leaders, we also want to maintain that connection to the U.S. population. And so as you see that divergence and making sure that we bring young soldiers, young leaders into our fold, how do we maintain that structure as well? I mean, the reserves have done it for us in the past, but it's now the discussion between whether they should be withdrawn more.
Well, you raise an absolutely daunting task, because as we get smaller, our penetration in society is going to get smaller. And as our penetration, remember, we fought this whole war with 1/10 of 1%. Is that the right number? 1/10 of 1% serving in the armed forces? Or is it? Just 1%.
Have served.
That's it. 1% have served. That's a low penetration to start with. And now we're going to drill down, and we're going to be keeping people longer. Because of the combat tours, people rotated out rather quickly. So the ability to penetrate society, how will we do that? I think we're going to have to do it the way we've always done it. The best spokesman for the Marine Corps is an ex-Marine. The best spokesman for the Foreign Service Corps is an ex-Foreign Service Corps member. And it's going to be the same for the Army. Now, we do have a tremendous benefit through the Guard and Reserve. That gives us a geographical distribution and a geographical penetration. But it's not going to be, yeah, I do civil military relations also, and I am concerned about the ability of the military to stay relevant to the next generation of Americans.
And that's where the student comes in. You talk about the fact that when someone thinks they want this, or foreign service, or whatever, that how do you know what, Greece, there's that long view of discernment where people gather around and they ask questions and they try to find, well, what is it in you that thinks this is stuff that you want to pursue? And that's...
Much of that used to work in the mediating institutions of our society, church, school, and family. That socializing mediation is not occurring to the same degree anymore. So our task is bigger. You're absolutely right. That's why we're doing this. But daunting. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have lots of work to do. And this is the long biography of Dr. Snider, and it has a number of his works on it. And so please feel free to take a copy of this. This presentation is being videotaped, and I hope it will be circulated too, so others can have it. Thank you all for coming to this first expert speakers forum event brought to you primarily by.
Thank you, Rob.
That's good. So you're an admiral? Are you an active
So we should take it was like you
Foreign service, I was able to. Well, I did it.
I just did when she started
Pretty much everywhere.
Yeah,
sure. I got snowed in there once. I was Moffett Field, X River, Glenview.
Give me a ride home.
So I grew up on science side. I graduated from the Naval Academy in '79.
Probably not. Yeah. Is it reels up, heels up? I could sleep anywhere. Radar can't sleep. Well, I've done a number of stuff. You sort of bounce around. I was a corporal officer in Helmand province with the Marines. That was interesting. And then the State Department was, Marine Corps was very organized. I worked in oceans environment science, climate change, which was going nowhere, which was very frustrating. And then I just came back from observer. That was very traditional. We're throwing money at the wrong stuff there. Buying Egyptian's tanks, they don't really need tanks. I mean, so much. I really think the biggest threat is just corruption. I mean, corruption. There are all these places that I was looking at this website. You go to Transparency International, and when we got involved in Afghanistan was dead last as far as corruption scale. And was it 11 years later? They're still dead. They're battling it out with Somalia and North Korea. How do you $1 trillion? That's what you get. Still in last place. Anyway,
So what Don is talking about, we kind of had
to come up with something.
You can take the department.
The Department of
90%
good.
under leadership, and therefore,
So Don kind of
but
has
in so doing, I kind of decided that
there are a lot of places that times dip their toes and people don't, they're asked. It's just starting pretty.
no, they don't. They don't.
Pretty
But
much
how else are you
that.
supposed to come up with something that, is like the basis on which we're all doing? We're trying to say where are we flawed? Why not use the systems that we're supposed to be evaluating on every year?
One of the things you talk about after action.
Other than just saying, okay, it's clear,
Foreign
you can
service.
read the FSA.
That you can read to everybody.
Well, in the Navy,
Right.
but I came back from 18
It
months
took me like an hour and a half to do it.
where
It took me
I was
like
seething about how much
just for the
they're not
because
interested.
I'm not doing
I mean,
this for another report until I
we had USAID doing things that was creating answers. And we were doing infrastructure that was basically enabling poppy culture.
And
it's like, really? And you know, they USAID basically outsourced they had guys, you know, these contractors only get $200 a year doing stupid shit. So no one, you know, I mean, we're gonna say Iraq and Afghanistan were successful.
We don't want to develop a whole new, what's the word? It's completely studied static, so.
That's that whole definition of it. Anyway, good talking to you. Good luck.
U.S. ambassador in Djibouti, and has worked a lot with the U.S. military, but she's also the head of the project on professionalism.
I'm the hired gun.
Was writing the project.
Well, it's a talent.
At the American Academy of Diplomacy, which is another one of the non-governmental foreign affairs organizations that are stakeholders in the State Department and the Foreign Service. And mostly the AAD, which the executive,
Yes.
and Mark Grossman.
And Tom Pickering was the chair.
Tom Pickering. So a lot of very stellar talent.
Yeah, I was going to say I know two of those two names, which means I passed some kind of quiz, not the other way around.
It's basically an association of retired, or former, I should say, former U.S. ambassadors, both career and political.
Yeah.
Mostly careers. The political ambassadors have their own Council of American Ambassadors.
So Scott Smith is my deputy, so he and I are pretty much. We are. This is our.
I have two cars.
So we were saying
I teach
mostly to listen to John and
subject matter diplomacy in NYU.
Oh,
Retired Foreign Service.
Oh,
wow.
Are you also in the Navy? Or?
I am. I'm a Navy captain.
Great. Yeah. And what is your area?
I'm a surface
I was, for a while, chief of mission in the Sultanate of Oman.
Oh, sure.
Saw a lot of...
when were you there?
I was there for a total of 5 years, but between 83 and 85, after I came out of 2 years in Iraq, and then in 2001 to 2004. So I was actually...
So I visited there in...
So how far along is that?
2001.
Yeah, was it after 9/11?
It was.
Yeah. Well,
in fact, we were the first destroyer in there after 2001.
Well, I took over as long-term sergeant d'affaires in 2001, and boy, I had a heavy-duty military education, but I had wonderful defense attaché people and Office of Military Cooperation people, and one of my most exciting times was on a P-3 aircraft that was flying into Seab North Air Base, and one of its engines flamed out, and I was actually in the cockpit, and the pilot said, "Mr. Dry, don't worry, we've got 3 more." Huge lightning bolt, coming out of one of them. And then Navy SEAL P5s, Mark 5s.
Yes.
They put me on those things and scooted me around. I became quite friendly with Admiral Robert Harwood.
Yes.
He became vice commander at Central Command.
That's right.
But at the time he was in Masira Island, Masira North. And then I used to liaise a lot with the Middle East Force in Bahrain.
Sure.
And much as Dr. Snider said, I remember calling him, the commander up the Admiral one, and saying, "Sir, I'd like to talk with you about my headache of the day." And he said, "What do you mean headache of the day? I got one every 5 minutes."
Sometimes it is.
Well, nice meeting you.
It was a pleasure meeting you.
Maybe we can somehow connect in this professionalism process. It's very difficult.
I think it would be very helpful for us to be able to characterize the
not ramifications, but
Our people don't have
the permutations of how the diplomatic service is trying to go through the same process that we are.
One of the points I often make is that we're also fatigued by these years of war and conflict, and we're constantly on a treadmill, and then the promotions smell, and when we come back to train, it's often just to train another language. I just use 5 languages, all the different language groups. Anyway, nice meeting. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
My card doesn't say anything about the project. It's just my, it's an unusual. Okay. After I retired, I was ambassador to Djibouti at the end. And when was that? I was beginning of '98 till the end of 2000. But then I went back in October 2003 to be the political advisor when they were ramping up. And I went initially for 3 months and ended up sitting the African Bureau said, I think the general needs somebody. And the general came back and he said, I need somebody. You know, I mean, so you're a JTF COA, yeah. Oh, wow. Which was, it was a Marine, the command module was Marine then. It then morphed into Navy and yes. It's Navy for quite some time now. It was interesting when AFRICOM stood up, people saying it's going to be a difficult transition for HOA because under CENTCOM they were support head command and then became a support head.
But you have to make changes now or you'll never get a long-term one.
I used to work on training exercises. I could see that AFRICOM did not understand how to use this back to
Okay. But no, I mean, the point of it is that they are now aware of it, and it's been talked for a while yesterday. Turns out, I didn't realize, turns out, you know, and the personalities that are used there. Yes, sir.
Well, CENTCOM, I have to say, did a better job because actually they've been doing the same kind of techniques since 1985. You know, the three, when I talk about it, the 3 techniques, the joint training, joint exercise.
Who, by the way, 2 nights ago, working in New York.
And they were doing that throughout the area before. So when they set up HOA and they came in, it wasn't as if they'd never been doing that kind of thing before. It was just the magnitude of it, the physical presence.
Well, it's done, it should be.
But, you know, I went back there in 2010. I was in Nairobi for 2 years in Somaliland, so they said, come and tell us about the election. And I found that all those things that we tried to put in place in the beginning to get them organized in 2003. You know, now with the way we use the email and the electronics, they start from ground zero every time. They don't rotation. Yeah, no matter, they say, well, it's in the computer, but where? Because it's not in here, it's not available. We spend a lot of bills, you know. Of course, that's what keeps the military busy in peacetime. The problem was we weren't in peacetime. I think in that, anyway, so nice to meet you.
I got hers. Okay. And well, nice meeting you.